I'm here to tell you the story of my daughter's experience with an online predator when she was 9 years old via a game. When I wrote the story, I called it a regular story that rarely gets told. Now, the reason why the story is rarely told is because it is not one that would grab newspaper headlines. Journalists tend to report on the more extreme cases, the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and this allows parents to detach and think that something like this will never happen to their child. My story represents the body of the iceberg, which is largely unseen and therefore rarely spoken about and seldom reported. It will demonstrate for you just how easily this can happen to any child, including your own, and the traumatic consequences can be substantial. My daughter Charlotte was a happy child. She had many friends. She loved doing things that most 8-year-old little girls love to do. She loved to play with her My Little Ponies collection. She became quite an expert at making slime. She loved gymnastics, and she had a real passion for dancing. The best way to describe Charlotte is that it would have been very difficult to walk away from her without a smile on your face. She really was the very essence of liveliness. But not long after her 9th birthday, something changed. What her stepfather and I noticed was a little girl who gave up everything she enjoyed. She no longer wanted to attend the dance classes that she'd once loved. She no longer wanted to go on play dates. She became withdrawn, listless, developed insomnia. But the most noticeable thing for me was her separation anxiety from me in particular. It got to the point where I couldn't even go to the supermarket, leaving her with her older siblings, without her insisting on accompanying me. One evening, we were taking our dogs for a walk, and Charlotte asked her stepfather and I a question. She said, "Do you have any hopes and dreams for the future?" We found this a strange question coming from a little girl of her age, so we simply responded that we did, and we asked her why she was asking. Her response was, "I have none." This was a red flag. Her stepfather is a psychiatrist. I manage his psychiatric practice, and we both began to become concerned that she may be developing a depressive syndrome, but we had no idea why. A few days later, her school called. They asked me to come and fetch Charlotte immediately. They said she was inconsolable. Sensing something was very wrong, I was able to make an appointment with a pediatrician who we'd previously seen for that afternoon. When I arrived at her school, her teacher approached me looking very concerned. And she said to me that Charlotte had told her that everyone in the world has a warm red heart, but that hers was cold and blue. These are words I will never forget because it gave me a clear indication as to how much she was struggling. We went to the pediatrician that afternoon. He assessed her and diagnosed her with clinical depression. He gave us a referral to see a psychologist, but he warned me that if he saw no improvement in Charlotte within a month, he would have no choice but to medicate her. Charlotte did not connect with the psychologist, and a month later, at the age of 9.5, was prescribed antidepressant medication. I remember this time of the year very clearly because it was around Christmas time. Charlotte still believed in Father Christmas. She came to me one day and said, "I do not want Father Christmas in the house." I asked her what was worrying her, and she said to me, "He's a stranger, I don't want him in the house." So I agreed that we'd hang the stockings outside the front door that year. In the new year, Charlotte and I started seeing a different psychologist, and after about 6 months, her pediatrician felt that she'd recovered sufficiently so that he could cease her medication. But I remained concerned. Charlotte had still not resumed any of the activities that she'd once loved. She was still reluctant to go on play dates, and she still showed significant separation anxiety from me. We continued to see the psychologist that year, and I was hopeful that my little girl would start to recover, but unfortunately this did not happen. At the beginning of her final year of primary school, her school sent out a note asking parents for permission for their children to participate in a sex education class. Charlotte was adamant that she did not want to participate in this class. I found this really strange because we'd had reasonably age-appropriate conversations about sex in our home. But what I can see now is that this was a trigger for her, because a few nights later, she called me into her bedroom and she said to me, "Mummy, I have done something terrible." I asked her if she could tell me anything more. She shook her head and scribbled 2 words on a piece of paper, the words sex and game. I wasn't entirely sure what she was trying to tell me, but seeing how difficult this disclosure was for her, I remained calm. I sat down next to her, I put my arms around her, and I gently asked her, "Is there anything more you can tell me?" She looked up at me tearfully and said to me, "I did the one thing you warned me not to do." I went onto the chat of a game I was playing online, and I started talking to another 9-year-old little girl. I didn't talk to her just once, I talked to her a few times. This little girl persuaded me eventually to perform sex acts within the game, and then she told me that if I told anyone what we'd been doing on the game or talking about in the chat, I'd be arrested. So for nearly 2 years, I've been afraid that at any moment the police would come and take me away from you. All I could do was comfort her. She was surprised. She said to me, "Why are you not angry with me?" And I said to her, "Because you were just a curious little girl, no different from many other little girls in this world. And I believe that person on the other side of the screen was an adult, because little children simply do not threaten other little children in this way." She wasn't able to be persuaded that night, so I sat with her until she fell asleep. But I got no sleep. Frankly, I was shocked that I had not considered that anything could have taken place online. I had been a vigilant parent. We had one iMac in the kitchen. There were restrictions on that iMac. So, for example, children were not able to download any app or game without our permission. So I really had no idea where this could have taken place, because at that point in time, Charlotte was not willing to tell me. The next day, I decided to call our local police station. I wasn't calling to make a report because I knew that Charlotte had not been on the game for over 2 years. I was calling to find out if they had a list of apps or games where they knew that predators hung out. The police officer said to me, wherever there are children online, there are predators. And then he asked me why I was calling, and I explained the situation to him. He said to me, "Please give your daughter a message. Please tell her she is innocent. This is predatory behaviour. They always threaten the child, sometimes leaving them too afraid to ever say anything." I remember I was driving that afternoon when I told Charlotte that I'd called the police. She started crying and said, "Are they coming to get me?" And I reassured her and I said no. And I gave her the message from that police officer, and she quietly absorbed this. A few months later, Charlotte asked me if I'd take her to see a dance band that she really loved. This was unusual for her. This is not something she previously would have suggested. So I saw this as a sign that she may be starting to recover. I agreed to take her on condition that she re-enroll in dance classes. But what this did was it provided her with a space where she could let go of some of the shame she'd been holding on to for so long. But more importantly, it reignited a passion that persists to this day. Charlotte is still dancing. When people ask me how I coped, I'll be honest, my feelings vacillated between being distraught and very angry. I had watched my little girl go from being a happy, vibrant child to a shadow of her former self. I'd watched her tormented for nearly 2 years before she found the courage to tell me what had happened to her. So what I decided to do was to channel these emotions into educating myself. I attended and enrolled in as many courses that I could possibly find on online child sexual exploitation. I attended webinars, I read journal articles, and I eventually enrolled in a degree in criminology and criminal justice. So with some of this knowledge behind me, I became concerned when my little boy started primary school in 2019. I was concerned because I noticed how many of his peers were allowed to use the internet or game online with very little supervision. And these were 6-year-olds. So instead of being that parent lecturing other parents, I decided to start Not My Kid, essentially offering resources and support for parents who needed it. But no one knew why I was so passionate about protecting children online. Through shame, Charlotte had sworn me to secrecy. She had allowed me to tell her stepfather, her biological father, and a few close friends, but no one else knew what had happened to her, not even her siblings. One of these close friends knew how guilty I was feeling at having been unable to protect my child, so she suggested that I write the story down as a way of healing for myself. I took her advice and I wrote the story in one sitting. I told Charlotte that I'd written a story. Her initial response was, "I do not want to read it." But a few days later, she asked me if she could read it, and then she asked me if she could share it with a close friend. So what putting this story on paper did for her was it allowed her to see herself as the little girl that she'd been when this had taken place. But more importantly, she started opening up. Up until this point, Charlotte had refused to speak about anything that had happened to her. We talked about everything to do with online safety, but she would not discuss what had happened to her. It was almost as though she'd blocked it from her mind. But after reading the story, she came to me. She told me the game she was playing. She said it was a game called Fresh Hotel, and she explained to me that Fresh Hotel was an exact replica of Habbo Hotel, only completely unrestricted. She was finally able to tell me where this had taken place, confirming for me that it had not happened in my home, but in fact the home of a close family friend. This is why I now encourage parents to understand the rules around the internet whenever their child spends time away from their home. She was also able to tell me how ashamed and responsible she felt. And this is precisely how predators silence our children. A year after writing the story, Charlotte was 16 years old. I asked her how she would feel if I put my name to the story. Up until this point, it had been shared anonymously on various Facebook pages, but I hadn't owned the story. And I needed her permission. Her response surprised me. She said to me, "Mummy, you need to be my voice. You need to help other parents understand how easily this can happen to their child." So in many ways, I'm here as a messenger. It's due to Charlotte's bravery, her courage, that I'm sharing her story with you today. And I'm incredibly proud of her. When people ask me if Charlotte's recovered, I can confidently say yes. She's now 20 years old and back to her happy, vibrant self. There were a few things that I believe contributed to that recovery. The first was my response that night. If I had got emotional or angry, she would have shut down. Instead, she was met with love, compassion, and I reassured her that I would help her. The second, and probably the most crucial, was that message from that police officer, because coming from the very people that she'd been so afraid of for nearly 2 years, his message was vital in validating her innocence. And I do believe once she received that message, she was gradually able to start to recover. But I have to emphasize, her recovery was gradual. And finally, my putting that story down on paper, because as I said, this allowed Charlotte to open up and process what had happened to her. So I'd like you to hear our story as one of hope, that when a child's disclosure is met with love and compassion, they are able to recover. But I'd ask you to consider the number of children who may not get such a response when they make a disclosure, whose parents may get angry, may blame them, or for those children who do not feel they have anyone safe that they can make a disclosure to. These children live with shame and trauma. Late last year, Charlotte approached me. She said to me she finally remembered why she couldn't sleep at night. I asked her why. And she said to me, "That person said he'd come and find me if I told anyone what we'd been doing on the game or talking about in the chat. And I was so afraid he would find me and I'd be killed in my sleep." I asked her if she'd shared any personal information with this person. And she said no, but she said, "Mummy, when little children are threatened, they believe it. And this can help them, this can make them feel terrified and alone." I can't help wondering how many other children there are out there too afraid to go to sleep at night after having received a similar type of threat. I'd like to conclude with the message that Charlotte gave me when she gave me permission to publish her story. You need to help other parents understand how easily this can happen to their child. And she's right. At the end of the day, for every parent that actively monitors and supervises their child's use of the internet, for every parent that ensures that devices are kept out of private spaces like bedrooms and bathrooms, for every parent that is willing to have open and honest conversations about the risks their children may face online, but most importantly, for every parent that reassures their child that if they do make a mistake online, they can come to them and they will be helped and supported, then I believe we potentially may have fewer victims. And I believe that is ultimately what matters. Thank you so much for listening.